You see, the truly frightening part about the end of a narcissist's life isn't the external decay, the loss of beauty, the wrinkles, or even the fading status. It's the collapse of the illusion that sustained them for decades, the illusion of control. For most of their lives, narcissists operate under a grand delusion, that they are the central force of every room they enter, that the world moves in accordance with their desires, and that people exist to orbit them like planets around the sun. But life, in its quiet cruelty, has a way of exposing the truth. It waits, it observes, and when the time comes, it strips away every comforting fantasy until only the raw, unmediated reality remains. The narcissist spends years crafting a carefully curated identity, one that projects strength, superiority, invulnerability. It's a psychological fortress built out of arrogance and denial. But the walls aren't made of stone, they're made of glass. And when the inevitable storms of life, failure, aging, rejection, strike, those walls begin to crack. The narcissist, who once seemed untouchable, suddenly finds themselves surrounded by fractures they can't control. That's the moment the illusion begins to die. They've built their life on manipulation. They believe that if they can control others, they can control reality itself. But that's the mistake. You cannot control the truth. You cannot rewrite the natural order of things. No amount of charm, coercion, or deceit can prevent the consequences of your actions from returning to you. And for a narcissist, that realization is devastating because it undermines the very core of their existence. They've mistaken dominance for strength, performance for authenticity, and attention for love. But when control slips away, and it always does, they are forced to confront something they have never known: powerlessness. Now, powerlessness is a terrifying experience for someone who's built their identity on control. For you and me, losing control is painful, but it's human. It humbles us, it teaches us, it makes us grow. For the narcissist, it feels like death, because without control, their entire sense of self disintegrates. Their grandiosity can no longer protect them. The lies they've told to others and to themselves can no longer shield them from reality. They realize that what they believed to be mastery was actually dependency, a constant need for validation, attention, and submission from others to sustain the illusion of superiority. And then something even darker happens. The narcissist begins to sense that the people around them are no longer willing to play along. Their manipulation loses its effect. Their charm no longer seduces. Their threats no longer intimidate. People begin to see through them. It's as if the world they once controlled suddenly develops a mind of its own. And that realization triggers panic. You can almost see it, the flicker in their eyes when they realize the script they've used their entire life no longer works. That's when desperation sets in. They grasp harder, manipulate deeper, demand more, but every attempt only accelerates the collapse. In this stage, the narcissist often turns inward in search of new strategies, but there's nothing left to manipulate. The mask begins to fall, and beneath it lies a frightened, fractured psyche, a person who has spent a lifetime avoiding the one confrontation that could have saved them the confrontation with themselves. And here's the paradox. The more they try to preserve control, the faster it slips away. Because control, by its very nature, is an illusion. The harder you cling to it, the more it reveals your weakness. True strength is not the ability to dominate, it's the capacity to adapt, to face truth, to take responsibility. But those are foreign concepts to the narcissist. Their entire being is built upon avoidance. What's truly tragic is that life, in its mercy, often gives people chances to change. The narcissist receives warnings, relationships that crumble, jobs that end, people who confront them. Each one is an invitation to self-awareness. But they reject every opportunity. They double down on the illusion, convincing themselves that the problem lies with everyone else. And by the time they reach the twilight of their life, there's nothing left to control, no one left to manipulate. The game is over. And it's in that stillness, that final absence of power, that they begin to understand the magnitude of what they've lost. Because control was never the goal, it was the disguise. Beneath it, there was always fear of inadequacy, fear of rejection, fear of being ordinary. The narcissists spent their entire life running from that fear, trying to dominate it, trying to bury it under admiration and authority. But in the end, the illusion collapses, and they are left with the one truth they cannot escape, that all the control in the world could not save them from themselves. And when that moment comes, it's not loud or dramatic, it's quiet. It's the silence of realization, the understanding that the power they worshiped was hollow. The control they clung to was a cage. And the person they thought they were never truly existed. You see, the narcissist's life revolves around a single fragile mechanism, a mirror. Not a literal one, of course, but a psychological mirror made up of the admiration, attention, and reactions of other people. For them, the reflection of others is the only proof that they exist, that they matter, that they're superior. It's not that they see themselves clearly. In fact, they can't. They only see what others reflect back. But as time goes on, as the charm fades and the people around them begin to disappear, that mirror starts to crack. And when it finally shatters, the narcissist faces something far more terrifying than loneliness. They face themselves. Now, the narcissist's reflection has always been distorted. They never looked in the mirror to understand who they are. They looked to confirm the image they wanted to project. Every compliment, every envious glance, every submission from others, those were like pieces of glass reinforcing a fantasy. But the fantasy isn't sustainable. Life is merciless with illusions. Age comes, failure comes. The people who once fed the narcissist ego begin to see through the mask. And suddenly, the reflection no longer flatters. It accuses. This is where the true psychological horror begins. When you've spent your entire life defining yourself through others, what happens when there are no others left to define you? The narcissist doesn't just lose validation, they lose identity. Because for them, the self is a performance, not a presence. It's a collection of roles, rehearsed expressions, and carefully chosen words designed to elicit praise. But when the applause stops, the stage goes dark. And in that silence, they realize something unbearable. They have no inner life. There's nothing genuine beneath the performance, just an echo chamber of need. The mirror, once their greatest source of power, becomes their greatest torment. Because now when they look into it, they see not the grand figure they imagined, but the emptiness they've spent a lifetime concealing. Every lie, every manipulation, every betrayal, they all stare back at them in that reflection. And it's not a noble confrontation. It's not redemption. It's disintegration. The narcissist doesn't know how to process shame or guilt. They've avoided those emotions like poison. So when the mirror finally forces them to see what they are, they experience it as psychological annihilation. The image that once sustained them now destroys them. You might wonder why this is so devastating. It's because the narcissist has never developed what psychologists call a stable internal self. They've lived entirely through external reference points, status, appearance, admiration. But when those vanish, the scaffolding collapses. What remains isn't strength or resilience, it's confusion. They look in the mirror and see a stranger. The very tool they once used to build power becomes a window into their weakness. And that's the tragedy. The narcissist doesn't just lose others, they lose the illusion of themselves. The mask that once seduced the world now clings to their face like something grotesque, something they can't peel off. They try to recreate the illusion, to rebuild the mirror, new relationships, new admirers, new facades, but it never reflects the same way again. People sense the desperation behind the charm now. They sense the falseness, the hollow tone in their voice. The narcissist becomes aware of this too, and that awareness eats at them. They begin to resent the very people they once needed, because every interaction now exposes the truth they can't bear to face. There's also something profoundly symbolic about this stage. The mirror turning against them represents the inversion of their entire psychological structure. For most of their life, they projected their inner darkness outward, blaming others, controlling others, twisting reality to protect their fragile ego. But now the direction reverses. The darkness turns inward, it consumes them. Every cruel word, every manipulation, every act of self-glorification, all of it circles back. The reflection becomes their judge, their jury, their sentence. And this isn't punishment from the outside. It's the natural consequence of living in a false relationship with oneself. You cannot spend decades lying to your own reflection and expect peace at the end. The narcissist's tragedy is that they've spent a lifetime avoiding the very thing that could have saved them self-awareness. They could have looked honestly into that mirror years ago, confronted their flaws, admitted their vulnerability, and begun to change. But they didn't. And so when the mirror finally turns against them, there's no time left to rebuild. At that point, they don't see potential, they see loss, they don't see a person. They see an empty vessel that once demanded to be admired. The mirror that once gave them life now takes it away. And as they stare into it, they begin to understand that they were never truly seen by anyone, not because others failed to look, but because they were never truly there to be seen. You see, every narcissist lives inside a story of their own creation, an empire of lies. It's a carefully engineered reality, one where they are always the hero, always the victim, or always the genius misunderstood by lesser minds. Every interaction, every relationship, Every success is rewritten to preserve that narrative. They twist truth not just to deceive others, but to protect themselves from the unbearable reality that they are ordinary, flawed, and deeply insecure. But there's a problem with building a life on deceit. Reality does not cooperate indefinitely. The truth has a gravity of its own, and eventually, it pulls everything back into alignment. At first, the narcissist's lies seem harmless, even clever. They exaggerate achievements, shift blame, manipulate stories to make themselves look noble. They charm people into believing their version of events. And for a while, it works. They begin to feel invincible, as if they've outsmarted the natural laws that govern human relationships. But each lie adds another brick to the structure, and over time, that structure becomes too heavy to maintain. It requires constant energy, constant vigilance, constant performance. They must remember who they lied to, what they said, and which version of themselves they presented. It's exhausting, and the deeper they go, the more reality begins to resist. The collapse doesn't happen all at once. It begins quietly. A contradiction surfaces. Someone catches them in an inconsistency. A person they've manipulated starts asking questions. Their reputation, once untouchable, begins to erode. People talk. They compare notes. And the narcissist, who once felt in control of every narrative, starts to lose control of all of them. This is when panic sets in, because the narcissist's sense of identity depends entirely on maintaining the illusion. Once the cracks appear, they're not just at risk of losing credibility, they're at risk of losing themselves. And here's where the irony becomes poetic. The very thing they use to climb, their deception, becomes the force that drags them down. Their empire of lies begins to consume itself. Every lie requires another to sustain it, and soon they find themselves trapped in a labyrinth of their own creation. The truth, which they've spent years avoiding, begins to close in like a tide. They try to rebuild, to shift blame again, to invent a new narrative. But now, the audience is gone. The people they once controlled no longer listen. Their words have lost weight. Their charm has lost its power. The story no longer sells. You see, lies have an interesting psychological cost. Each one separates a person further from reality. The narcissist lives in a world of distortions, where cause and effect no longer align, where guilt and accountability are always someone else's problem. But the human mind can't bear disconnection from truth forever. Sooner or later, the tension between illusion and reality becomes unbearable. The narcissist starts to feel it, an internal chaos, an erosion of coherence. They begin to contradict themselves not because they want to, but because they no longer know what's real. Their memory fails them not from age, but from confusion. When you lie long enough, you forget what's true, even to yourself. And then comes exposure. Sometimes it's public. A career collapses. A partner walks away. Their reputation is destroyed. Sometimes it's private, an intimate moment where someone finally confronts them, or a sudden realization that no one believes them anymore. That's when their world begins to cave in. The empire they built with words turns to dust. Every manipulation they thought was strength reveals itself as cowardice. Every deceit they justified as strategy exposes itself as self-betrayal. And standing in that wreckage, they face the one truth they can't rewrite, that they were the architect of their own downfall. It's a profoundly moral reckoning. Because deception always carries a price, and the narcissist pays it in the most personal currency, trust. Once trust is gone, there is no empire left to rule. They become exiles in a world that no longer believes in them. They wander through the ruins of relationships, credibility, and self-respect, trying to convince themselves that it's still someone else's fault. But the echoes of their lies follow them. Every manipulation, every betrayal, they return like ghosts, and those ghosts never leave. The tragedy of the narcissist isn't just that their empire falls, it's that they can't accept why. They'll rebuild the same delusions over and over, even in the face of total isolation. Because to admit the truth would mean killing the false self they've lived as for decades. And for them, that feels like death. So they cling to the ashes of their lies, insisting they're still a kingdom. But everyone else can see the truth. The curtain has fallen. The performance is over. And in that silence, when the applause has faded and the mask has cracked beyond repair, the narcissist faces the one reality they can't manipulate anymore, that the empire they built wasn't destroyed by others. It was devoured from within. You see, when the applause fades and the audience leaves, what remains is silence. And for a narcissist, that silence is unbearable. It's not just the absence of sound, it's the absence of validation, the absence of identity. They've spent their entire lives feeding off external approval, constructing their sense of worth from admiration and control. But when that supply runs out, they're forced to confront what's inside. And what's inside isn't strength or peace, it's emptiness. That emptiness is not an exaggeration, it's psychological reality. The narcissist's sense of self has always been hollow because it wasn't built from authenticity. It was built from reaction. They define themselves by contrast, not by truth. They exist only in opposition to others better than, smarter than, more powerful than. But when there's no one left to compare themselves to, the scaffolding collapses. The mask, once so convincing, begins to slip, and beneath it there's nothing substantial to hold on to. For most people, solitude can be restorative. It's in solitude that we integrate, reflect, and rediscover our values. But for the narcissist, solitude is annihilation, because to be alone is to be unseen, and to be unseen is to be unreal. They've replaced their inner life with performance for so long that when the stage goes dark, they don't know who they are without the lights. This is why you often see narcissists panic when they lose status or attention. They experience it as psychological death. Their existence has been so thoroughly externalized that they can't feel real without an audience confirming it. In the early stages of this decline, they'll fight desperately to fill the void. They'll chase new admirers, fabricate new dramas, or even provoke conflict just to feel something again. Conflict, after all, still provides attention. It still mirrors them back to themselves, even if negatively. But over time, those tactics lose effectiveness. People stop responding. The phone doesn't ring. The messages go unanswered. The narcissist, once the center of every interaction, now finds themselves on the periphery of other people's lives, irrelevant, forgotten, excluded. And this is when the torment truly begins. Because now, the narcissist is forced into confrontation with the one person they've avoided their entire life, themselves. The silence begins to echo, and what it echoes back is terror. They start to feel the full weight of their own emptiness. There's no validation, no admiration, no power left to distract them from the truth that their inner world is barren. It's not that they don't know how to love or connect. It's that they never developed the capacity to. They've spent so long pretending to be more than human that they've forgotten how to simply be human. Psychologically, this stage resembles withdrawal. The narcissist is addicted to admiration, and when it's gone, the symptoms mirror those of any other addiction: restlessness, anger, depression, despair. But unlike a substance, you can't replace people. You can't fabricate genuine connection out of nothing. And so they spiral. They retreat into memories of past glory, replaying moments of triumph, convincing themselves that they'll rise again. But deep down, they know the truth. Those moments are gone, and they're not coming back. This emptiness also manifests as self-loathing. The narcissist begins to hate the very self they once glorified, because now, stripped of illusion, they see how fragile it really is. Every insult they ever projected onto others, the weakness, the insecurity, the dependency, comes home to them. And it's unbearable. But instead of accepting responsibility, they often externalize it again, blaming the world, the people who abandoned them, the unfairness of life. They double down on bitterness because admitting fault would mean dismantling the last defense their ego has left. And yet, the tragedy is that redemption was always possible. The narcissist could have faced this emptiness earlier, when it was still a whisper instead of a scream. They could have acknowledged their need for love, their fear of inadequacy, their vulnerability. That confrontation could have led to humility, and humility could have led to growth. But they refused it every step of the way. They traded truth for comfort, depth for image, and love for control. And by the time life demands that they look inward, there's almost nothing left to look at. What makes this so haunting is that the emptiness isn't punishment, it's consequence. It's the natural result of a life spent chasing illusion at the expense of reality. When you build yourself around lies, you become hollow. When you silence conscience, you silence meaning. And when you destroy connection, you destroy the very thing that makes life worth living. So when the narcissist sits alone at the end, no followers, no admirers, no family left to manipulate. They finally face the truth they've avoided all along. The torment of emptiness isn't something done to them, it's something they created. And no amount of denial can save them from it anymore. You see, one of the cruelest ironies of the narcissist's life is that they spend decades crafting their own isolation. And then, in the end, they are destroyed by it. The narcissist burns every bridge they cross, often without realizing it. Every relationship becomes a transaction, every person a tool to serve their ego. They charm, they manipulate, they extract what they need: admiration, loyalty, validation. And once that person stops providing it, they discard them without hesitation. To the narcissist, relationships are not about connection, They are about control. But the tragedy is that control comes at a cost. Because one day, when they finally need someone, not as a mirror, not as an audience, but as a human being, no one remains. It doesn't happen suddenly. At first, their isolation is masked by success or charisma. They have people around them, colleagues, admirers, sometimes even family, who appear devoted. But those relationships are shallow, conditional, and always transactional. The people who love them eventually realize that love is not being returned, that their loyalty is being exploited. Slowly, quietly, they begin to pull away. Some leave in anger, others in exhaustion, and some simply fade out of reach. The narcissist doesn't notice it at first because they confuse attention with affection. But attention fades faster than love. And when it's gone, they are left standing in an empty room, wondering why no one calls, why no one comes back. When you've built your life on using people, you eventually run out of people to use. And this is when the narcissist's real suffering begins. They can no longer manipulate others into staying because those old tactics no longer work. The charm that once dazzled now rings hollow. The threats that once intimidated now sound desperate. Even pity loses its power because the people who once cared have learned the cost of caring. And in that moment, the narcissist begins to understand something they've avoided their entire life. Relationships cannot be sustained without reciprocity. You cannot take endlessly and expect to be loved. This realization, however, doesn't bring humility, it brings rage. The narcissist feels betrayed by the very people they betrayed. They see their isolation not as consequence, but as injustice. They tell themselves that others were weak, ungrateful, or disloyal. It's a desperate psychological defense because the truth, that they are alone because of their own behavior, is too painful to face. But the deeper tragedy is that even if they wanted to change at this point, they don't know how. They've spent so long performing strength that they've lost the capacity for vulnerability. They don't know how to apologize, how to listen, how to connect without manipulation. The emotional muscles that sustain genuine intimacy have atrophied. And by the time they realize it, the damage is irreversible. As they grow older, that isolation becomes physical as well as psychological. The calls stop coming. Invitations dry up. Even their family, those they assumed would tolerate them forever, begin to keep their distance. The narcissist's home, once filled with noise and activity, becomes quiet. The silence that once symbolized power now feels like punishment. And the very walls that once contained their self-importance now feel like a prison. They sit surrounded by trophies of past victories, symbols of a life that looked successful on the outside, but was emotionally bankrupt on the inside. You can almost imagine the internal dialogue that begins to haunt them. Where did everyone go? Why did they leave? But the answer is not outside, it's inside. Every act of control, every manipulation, every betrayal was another brick in the walls they built around themselves. They thought they were fortifying their independence, but they were really constructing a cage. It's poetic justice in the deepest sense, because the isolation they now endure is not random, it's the final expression of who they truly became. Philosophically, this is where the narcissist faces the ultimate truth about human existence. That meaning is born in relationship. It's through others that we discover ourselves. Love, friendship, empathy. These are not luxuries, they are lifelines. And when you sever those ties in pursuit of ego, you sever your own humanity. That's why the narcissist end is so tragic. They don't just lose people, they lose access to meaning itself. Their life becomes sterile, mechanical, devoid of warmth. And in that state, they begin to realize that all their victories were hollow, all their triumphs were empty, because there's no one left to share them with. And then, when they finally do need someone, not for admiration, but for comfort, no one answers. The world has moved on. The empire they built has forgotten them. And they sit alone, surrounded by the ghosts of the people they used to dominate, haunted by the memory of the faces they once dismissed. It's not that the world turned its back on them, it's that they turned their back on the world. At some point, every illusion runs out of road. For the narcissist, that moment is the reckoning, the point at which reality finally demands payment for all the years of deceit, manipulation, and self-delusion. It doesn't always come in some dramatic explosion. Often, it arrives quietly, disguised as consequence. Maybe it's the loss of status, the collapse of a relationship, or the slow, painful erosion of relevance. But when it comes, it's absolute. Because the one thing no one escapes, no matter how cunning or powerful, is truth. And when truth comes for the narcissist, it doesn't knock. It walks straight in. The narcissist spends their entire life running from accountability. They rewrite every story to ensure they're never the villain. They convince themselves that they're misunderstood, that others are weak, that life has treated them unfairly. This constant denial of responsibility is their armor, but the longer they wear it, the more it corrodes them from within. Because accountability, as painful as it is, gives structure to the soul. It allows you to learn to adapt, to become more than your failures. Without it, you remain stagnant, trapped in perpetual adolescence. And that's exactly what happens to the narcissist. They never grow up. For decades, they can maintain the illusion that they're winning. They manipulate situations to their favor, they gather followers who admire or fear them, and they interpret every outcome as proof of superiority. But life is not static. Time, age, and truth have a way of wearing down falsehoods. The narcissist can avoid self-awareness for a while, but not forever. Eventually, life exposes what they've built. The job they once dominated now belongs to someone younger, hungrier, less tolerant of their arrogance. The family that endured their cruelty stops calling. The reputation that once seemed unshakable begins to crumble. And in that decline, they experience something they've never prepared for, the collapse of the identity they thought was immortal. This is the reckoning. It's the point where the narcissist is forced to confront the truth they've avoided all their life, that they are the architect of their own suffering. The empire of lies, the isolation, the emptiness, all of it was self-created. There's no one left to blame. And when that realization dawns, it's psychologically devastating. Because to accept responsibility after a lifetime of denial requires dismantling the entire structure of the self. It's not just painful, it's annihilating. Now, some might imagine that this reckoning leads to transformation. And in rare cases, it can. A small number of narcissists, faced with undeniable truth, finally experience a kind of psychological death that opens the door to rebirth. They let the false self die. They start to understand humility, to feel genuine remorse. But for most, that process never begins. The reckoning doesn't redeem them, it breaks them. Instead of surrendering to truth, they double down on denial. They rewrite their failures as injustices, their punishments as proof of their uniqueness. They cling to their false identity with desperate intensity, even as it collapses around them. It's like watching someone try to breathe life back into a ghost. There's something profoundly tragic about this, because the narcissist's downfall is never purely external, it's internal. It's not the loss of wealth or reputation that destroys them, it's the loss of illusion. The identity they've spent a lifetime defending turns out to be hollow, and that realization is too much to bear. They have no internal foundation to stand on, no conscience, no genuine values, no authentic relationships. When the mask falls, there's nothing left behind it. And so they spiral into bitterness, paranoia, and despair. They blame everyone else. They rewrite the past. They try to resurrect their old persona in smaller, sadder forms, boasting to people who no longer listen, trying to impress those who no longer care. But the world has moved on. Philosophically, this is where the narcissist meets the ultimate truth of existence, that every human life, in the end, is judged not by how much power it exerted, but by how much truth it embodied. Power fades, beauty fades, influence fades, but truth remains. And when your life has been constructed in opposition to truth, the final judgment isn't external, it's internal. It's the mind turning on itself. The reckoning is not God's wrath or society's revenge, it's the psyche demanding balance. It's the soul saying, enough. What makes this conclusion so haunting is that it's perfectly just. The narcissist, who has spent a lifetime evading reality, is finally consumed by it. They run out of lies to tell, people to blame, and masks to wear. And when they're stripped bare, the reckoning reveals not a monster, but something far more pitiful, a frightened, broken human being who could have been so much more if only they'd faced the truth sooner.